Bueno, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Silvia Keimetlian y vamos a continuar entonces viendo, como estuvimos viendo de mañana, otros temas sobre
Recommendations that we would like to make in order to benefit as much as possible from the use of GeneXus, and in this case, the suite. During the morning, we looked at different new things GeneXus has launched in order to facilitate the adoption of these new features by you. And it is important to develop software, but also it is important to control the versions that we develop. With regard to the development of software with GeneXus, the recommendation from our side is to use GeneXus Server together with GeneXus. So before getting into details about the server, I would like to know who among you is using GeneXus Server. So you are familiar with it. GeneXus Server in version 15, well, a few less. I suppose that even if you don't use even if you don't use the Nexus server, you know what it's about, how it works. But anyway, I'm going to make a short introduction. GeneXus Server is a repository for GeneXus knowledge bases. All of us who work in software development know how important it is to have a control of the versions of the applications we develop. Sometimes it is thought that the versions control or the use of a tool of versions control are associated only to people who work together in a team or large teams. It is necessary to know which are the versions that have undergone changes, which are the versions that are ready to be tested or to go on into production. And all this usually is related to development teams that have a lot of people. But what happens if there's only one person working on this? When you work by yourselves, sometimes you work in GeneXus in your local KB and you have to make a change. And you're going to test something, you don't know whether it's going to work or not, and therefore you make a copy of the knowledge base. You start working, and then you make a new copy of the KB, and at some point you lose track of which version has the changes, which is the latest one. So working by yourselves doesn't seem to have an advantage in this regard. So it's fundamental to have a tool that helps you. Now, in a team that has several people, having good tools to control the versions is also a big help. So now we are going to see which are the recommendations and good practices that we advise you to use and how GeneXus Server can help us or which advantages it can offer with regard to these functionalities. As I just said, a first problem we see is how to separate my development environment, which is the environment that has all those changes that I want to put into production, how I identify the environments. So the first recommendation is to use separate workplaces. What do I mean? Well, usually what we have is a development team that works with their local knowledge bases, and then a KB in GeneXus Server where all the work is consolidated. We know that the KB in GeneXus Server is the one that has all the changes. So based on this knowledge base and the KB that is in the server, the developers create their local knowledge bases. And on the other hand, we recommend to have a different environment, a different KB maybe in another computer that is also a KB that was created based on the GeneXus server KB, but this KB, and we'll see its features later, is the KB where I assemble the version that I'm going to test and put the automatic tests, etc. So the development environments have to be well identified and separate. Now, local KBs were created on the basis of a front server, and the KB in the server at some point a developer sent it to the server so that the rest of the team would be able to synchronize with that knowledge base. The development team, that is to say the people who are going to work with the KB, communicate with GeneXus Server with the operations of commit and update, which we have already seen. Each one of them is going to decide when they will change through the commit operation their changes to the server, and will also do it in an applied manner. That is to say, he's going to decide when he will synchronize to the changes that the other developers did. It's a developer that has to decide when he sends the changes, when he carries out the operations, but as we will see in these recommendations, we will tell you when it is recommended to carry out these operations and with what frequency, because this will help you in your development work. So let's look at the work of the development team. They are connected to the knowledge base in GeneXus Server, and I will give you some examples. I will tell you an example about the travel agency KB, and the objects I will describe are based on those knowledge base. What is the first recommendation I would make? The commits you make have to be periodical, and the sooner the better. What do I mean? You don't need to wait for a big set of objects before committing to the server. Sometimes we make a lot of local changes, we do the commit, and by that time a lot of objects have changed, and that may be confusing. I don't know well whether the objects that are there are modified so as to do the commit or not. So an advantage is that it's easier to understand the changes I'm making and the ones I'm sending to the server. Another important topic is what happens if I do a commit of an object and for some reason the object changes something or breaks something in the application. I have to undo it. So a set of small objects to do the commit will allow me to identify quickly which is the object that has a problem and undo the change. Another advantage is that there will be less chances of conflict with regard to the objects for which the commit is done. If you have comments or questions, please let me know as we go. But as Maya said, the material will be available. You will have access to all of these presentations. GeneXus also has versions, and the use of the X server doesn't mean that the developer stops using the other versions. He can manage many. Indeed, in a few minutes we are going to talk specifically about the versions, but you are quite right. Both GeneXus and GeneXus Server allow you to handle different versions, and I'll give you some recommendations with regard to the use of versions. Now, when I do a create cover front service, I can do it for all of the versions in the knowledge base in the server or for a version in particular. Just bear this in mind for the time being. So, another recommendation concerning the commit operation. It's important to write good commit messages for a set of objects. you must always think that when we make a commit of a set of objects, we are adding new functionalities or correcting a bug. So when another developer reads the comment, by reading it, it is important that he understands which sets of objects were changed, why was the change made, etc. An example which is quite simple, but something that can actually happen. I am developing a module of an application, and when I commit, I just write new object. Is this a good comment? No, it's bad, of course not. It's not the way to go. But if I am developing the attraction module associated to the KB travel agency, and I have the word width for the web and the word width for SD, and I put all this comment, obviously it will be much more understandable, and another developer who reads this comment will know what all this is about. If you look up in internet and in Google the rules and the documents, there are many recommendations about these comments that you should write in the commit. They happen not only with the GeneXus server, there are other tools to manage versions, and obviously all the teams that work with tools have the same difficulties. The rules state if you are going to write a comment associated to a commit, the first sentence should be a summary of the commit I'm making. I can add more lines with more details, the reasons for the change, for example. So when you write something, bear in mind that you may have your own internal rules, or anyway, you should define a methodology for each team. Even if it's a commit that corrects an error, well, sometimes teams have internal systems to handle issues, and they give numbers to their actions to correct errors, so the number can be associated to the commit so that the commit can be well identified. Other recommendations: commit concerning related changes. This will make things much more orderly. If I have a commit, it's not the same thing to see all of the objects like this. Let's say I have 30 objects for the commit, and I do the commit, and maybe I have an idea of which objects correspond to each change or functionality, but it's good to commit related objects. In GeneXus Server, we have a functionality that is very helpful. It is the change set functionality, which allows us to define groups for the objects. If when I'm going to do a commit, like the one I showed before, I can mark some objects, I can define a change set with the right button, and I put in the change set a description. In this case, for example, this change set, or the objects that have been added to this change set, show that I made a change to correct a certain issue that had been reported. Or else these objects that I'm grouping in the change set model flights add functionality to the model of flights. So this is an orderly way of visualize the objects, the objects, and here in the window of team development, when I'm going to commit the objects, the change set disappears. It's something that I use in order to put order in the commit. I define the change set, I group the objects, and then the change set disappears. So, as I said, this allows me to group the objects depending of certain functionalities or certain criteria I need. Another fundamental thing when I'm going to do the commit, I should see the objects that are there and see whether they should really be there. but maybe I modified an object to make an internal test or comment a certain code, and I don't want the login object to be there because I'm doing the test. And when I do the commit, the object has been modified, but it shouldn't have been. So in the commit window, it's a good time to review the objects that appear there, see which changes they have undergone, to see whether they should actually be there, etc., before doing the commit.
Entonces hablamos de
So far, then, we've been saying when we recommend making commit and what questions to have in mind. Now, let's see when we recommend not doing commit. It's not whenever you have a change that you have to make a commit. When do you think we could say, well, for the time being, let's wait a little and let's do no commit? It hasn't ever happened to you? When there are big changes, or when the structure changes and you may break down something, or you can't put it in production, or well, there are times when you can say, well, I have to wait. When I have a code that I know is going to break something, or I haven't put something and I put it in an attribute and now it's not going to work, I may wait a little bit to have this functionality better solved. For instance, as we said, when something is halfway through, I'm defining a certain functionality, but not all objects are ready. And then when everything is ready, I would do the commit. Or when I haven't tested the work I'm doing, it's fundamental that whenever I develop something or functionality or certain objects, I should try it out in a local environment to know that what I've done or what I've corrected can certainly work before I do a commit. As we said earlier, we have separated environments. Each developer will have his own environment with the local IS to test all his objects there, and then the application will start, will be under production. But my unit test I have to be sure that it's going to work. So it's fundamental that developers get used to testing their things before doing a commit. Well, how does GeneXus Server help you? Well, not to do commit of things that you know they're not going to work well. So in our GeneXus Server, we have a functionality that allows us to do partial commits. This means that if I have an object with several changes, but I don't want all changes to go to GeneXus Server, then I can say, look, this change that I've just made, or this code that I've just added, please don't add it in the commit. Let's see an example. Let's suppose that I have this web panel, which was already in my application. It's got a grid. And what I added, well, I'm going to make two changes there. On the one hand, I'm going to add an attribute to the grid that the user asked me, the one making the test of the application. I added that attribute. And the other change is adding the click event of an image to call in another web panel. Now, this functionality, I haven't completed it yet. I'm going to call an object. I'm just developing the object. So I don't want to go and make that change and put it in production. But my client is asking for the change of adding a new attribute in the grill. So when I'm going to make a commit, I do get the modified object for commit. I could click the right button and show differences. And there, I'm going to see what differences are there between my local object and the one in GeneXus Server. And you're going to see that the difference is shown first in the work form for the attribute I've added, and the other change is the events. And the code I've added, it's this one. So I've got the option here to click on the right button and say, please exclude this block of codes from my commit. Now, what happens here is that this code is going to be marked, highlighted in a different way, and this will be indicating that this code will not go in the commit of the object. Now, it's as if I was editing somehow the window of the comparison. Is not something that we do usually, but in this particular case, I can. So once I've marked that code as not including it in the commit, I would go to save, and I will go back to the commit function. You can see that the web panel is in another color, and it's because it's as if the comparer had modified. So after having the object here, I would do commit, and I would make sure that the code I've added was not in the commit, but just in the change here. So I would open the object. I've got everything I wanted in my object. I'm not going to lose anything there because you are only saving it to the memory. And I go on working until I complete my functionality. So that's a way that if I've got in different changes in one same object to add functionalities, and I don't want to add one of them, then it's partial commit is a good option to use in these cases. Now, another very important functionality, of course, when we're talking about versions to control options, is to keep a record of the changes. Because every change you make, you want to know who made this change, what was added, what date, and so on. In GeneXus Server, we've got several ways of obtaining that information. On the one hand, we can obtain it from GeneXus Server's console. When I have access to the console, in the activity status, I can see all the changes made for that KB. I can see the user who made the change, what operation was done, and the date. Now look here, perhaps you can't see it very well, but these are the comments from the commit. It's most important what we said at the beginning. That is, it's very important to write good comments when you're going to make commit, because it's a way of seeing what the activity in the KB was, and by reading the comments, I can very easily find out what's happened. So that recommendation of writing good comments, it's something that is very useful here to know what information is in the KB. Now, as I said, I can see this information in the console of GeneXus Server. Now, that same information, I can also see it in GeneXus. In the option Development History, I can once again see the same information, but from GeneXus. So I can have a detail of all the commits made, the user, the date, and so on. Furthermore, I have another option. If I want to go into further details, here I can see all the activities in the KB, but if I want to go into the detail of the history of the record of only one object, then in that case, show her server history, I would click there, and I would be able to see something for one particular object, who made the changes and what the changes were. So the same information as today, what user, when was the commit made, what objects were modified, and so on. Now, if I want to go even further deep, and I want to know not only the object, but the line of the object, then we have this option. This is not to accuse anyone for any changes. That's not the case. But hasn't it happened to you that when you work with a tool to manage versions, you forget who added the line codes? And sometimes it was you, but sometimes we forget. So for each block of code, you have a different color depending of who the user was, the user who introduced the changes. So we can see a different granularity there to provide the same information at KB level, object, and the line of each object to know who modified it. Very well. Now, if we talk about a tool that gives us a way of managing this version, it is fundamental to use versions. Now, whenever we work with an application, there's no doubt that we are fulfilling cycles, and so we start with developing the application, then we decide that this group of functionalities or this module that I've developed, I would like to take it up to production. And so that's when I define a version, and that version will carry out all its process, tests, and production depending on the environment where I work. So in what cases will I need to define a version? Well, no doubt when I'm defining new features. If I released feature 1 and I'm going to build a new one, what I'm going to do is to freeze the version I've already worked on and given my clients, and I start working on the new version. Also, when I want to correct bugs, and for instance, sometimes while the client is testing the version, then I have to correct an urgent case in the same version that the client is using. So in some way, I can define a new version, I can make a correction. I'm going to see this in an example, but the idea is to integrate all the changes.